When you think of the Strategic Air Command jets like the Boeing B-47 and B-52 come to mind. However, before these airplanes, there was another aircraft. It was a Convair B-36. In 1940, Nazi Germany already controlled the majority of Europe. An isolationist America watches as Hitler's fast and deadly blitzkrieg war machine attacks England. The Battle of Britain has started. Japan's fast growth in the Pacific continues unabated despite America's objections. At Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, California, the first intercontinental bomber is expected. Engineers began advanced research, the first outcome being the Model 35, a four-engined pusher-tractor arrangement. In early 1941, when Hitler started Operation Sea Lion, the United States military believed England's defenses would disintegrate under the Luftwaffe's unrelenting attacks. With Britain surrendered, it was expected that Germany, and maybe Japan, would launch a naval attack on the United States. Any American bombing campaign against Germany or Japan would necessitate the launch of an airplane from our continent. Faced with this possibility, the Army Air Corps issued an order on April 11, 1941. This regulation required an aircraft capable of the following: transport a 10,000-pound bomb load to a target 5,000 kilometers away. Carry a 72,000-pound bomb load over a limited distance. Fly at 300 to 400 miles per hour. Takeoff and landing on a 5,000-foot runway. The Boeing Aircraft Company was approached about the competition. At the time, Boeing was manufacturing the B-17C bomber for the Army Air Corps. These planes will become legendary during the Allied air assault on Europe in the coming battle. Boeing assessed that no aircraft could be manufactured to match the given standards and submitted no competition-worthy concepts. Douglas aircraft would enter the race unsolicited based on the massive XB-19, which had been in development since 1936. The XB-19, which first flew in June 1941, was eventually determined to be inappropriate for the Air Corps' needs due to its 212-foot wingspan. However, many of the systems designed for the massive XB-19 would be used later in the V-36. The Northrop Corporation of Hawthorne, California, led by Jack Northrop, seen here in the center between his primary design team members, Walt Cerny and Dr. William Sears, believed that the next logical step in the evolution of aircraft design lay with the low aerodynamic drag inherent in all wing aircraft. Northrop Corporation, encouraged by the success of its N-1M, would enter the competition uninvited. Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego, California, was the only other business invited to compete, and it was developing the PBY Catalina series of aircraft for the United States Navy. Consolidated, like Boeing, had commenced manufacturing of its renowned bomber aircraft for the upcoming war. It was a B-24 Liberator. The B-24's long range and big bomb load would allow it to operate successfully in all theaters of conflict. By the end of the war, 8-ton 482 B-24s had been constructed more than any other bomber throughout World War II. Consolidated's entry for the competition was a 6-engine pusher layout that retained the twin-tail assembly from the Model 35, which was first designed in 1940. Consolidated believed that a pusher arrangement which allows for better airflow over the wing and reduces aerodynamic drag would be most suited to achieving the required range. Consolidated's preliminary design was presented to the Air Materiel Command on October 6, 1941. On November 15, 1941, a contract for the purchase of 2 aircraft was issued. Faced with a big engineering assignment, Consolidated began working on the B-36 aircraft right away. The first aircraft was intended to be delivered in 30 months. Simultaneously, the Army Air Forces granted Northrop Corporation a contract for a single aircraft, the B-35. This daring design, known as the Flying Wing, continues to pique the interest of aircraft enthusiasts. December 7th, and the United States is at war. The conflict would quickly shift priorities at Consolidated. A partial wooden mock-up was built in San Diego. The mock-up was accepted by Air Materiel Command in September and given top priority, owing primarily to significant losses by the American fleet in the Pacific.
The war would soon change priorities at Consolidated.
The emphasis was short-lived, as America gave the Japanese their first significant setback at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. A significant delay occurred when the decision was taken in August to relocate the B-36 program to the new government plant in Fort Worth, Texas. This decision was motivated by fears of Japanese strikes on the West Coast. By mid-1943, the Allies' air campaign in Europe was seeking to limit Germany's ability to wage war. B-24s and B-17s began focusing precision daylight bombing raids on Germany's manufacturing sites. This plan did not come without significant sacrifices to American bombers and lives, since sorties were flown far into Germany. Following repeated high losses, the Air Corps focused on the creation of long-range fighters for escort. In the Pacific, the Allies aimed to gain sites within bombing range of Japan's mainland. At home, war production reached an all-time high. Suppliers who were already under pressure from war manufacturing needs were hesitant to furnish specialized parts for an aircraft with only 2 orders. To help expedite the badly required long-range B-36, Air Materiel Command issued a letter of intent to purchase 100 B-36s in July 1943. It was thought that the promise of large-scale production would alleviate the problem. Following considerable testing in the fall of 1943, both Consolidated and Air Materiel Command determined that the twin-tail arrangement lacked the required strength and would need to be revised. The introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters in the spring of 1944 provided Allied bombers with the necessary protection to fly deep into German territory. The attacks remained focused on oil and manufacturing targets to weaken the German war economy. On the Western Front, the Allies liberated France after landing on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6th. By the end of the year, on the Eastern Front, the Russian counterattack had driven the Germans back to Warsaw and Budapest. The tide had also turned against the Japanese. America now controlled the air and sea as it reclaimed the South Pacific from Japan, leapfrogging from island to island in what would be the deadliest fighting of the war. In July, the Americans took control of the Mariana Islands. These islands would serve as a base for the 21st Bomber Command's new long-range B-29s, which would launch attacks on Japan's mainland in November. Consolidated was directed to focus only on the production of the long-range B-32 for deployment in the Mariana. Appearance
of the B-32 Dominator in the Pacific opens a new phase in the super bomber program predicted by General Arnold. First planned as a twin of the B-29 Superfort, the Dominator was redesigned as a more conventional plane without pressurized cabins. An outstanding recognition feature is the huge single fin and rudder. Though slightly smaller than the 29, the 32 carries more armament. This powerful new companion to the B-29 equals the Superfort's range, speed, and destructive potential. These two bomber giants, appearing within a year's time, forecast constantly increasing air blows against the Jap homeland.
The XB-36 program's progress was once again slowed to fulfill wartime demands. By early 1945, Germany was on the verge of collapse. Its war economy collapsed, and its people were demoralized. The unconditional surrender came on May 8th. The long and deadly battle in Europe had ended. In the Pacific, B-29s made repeated attempts to bomb Japan into unconditional surrender. In March, General Curtis LeMay used incendiary bombs to conduct low-level nighttime bombing. Tokyo burned, but the Japanese refused to surrender. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 superfortress Enola Gay neared the city of Hiroshima, Japan. Strategic bombing has acquired a new weapon that would forever alter the paradigm of warfare. The battle came to an end quickly as atomic warfare became a reality. As Americans rejoiced after the conflict, the prospect of a future battle in which both sides used nuclear weapons was a nightmare that had to be avoided. For the United States, the solution was to establish a peacekeeping force so powerful that no nation on the planet would dare to challenge it. The Strategic Air Command was thus established on March 20, 1946. The newly constituted Strategic Air Command would keep a careful eye on our wartime friends, the Russians, as they began their expansion by squeezing the buffer states that guarded their borders in Europe. Consolidated steel for the B-32 was terminated. Uncompleted aircraft were destroyed in place to make way for the new program, which is now a key priority due to its long intercontinental range and massive size. The military desired the threat of delivering the new and massive atomic bombs to any site within Russia. By late August 1945, the XB-36 prototype was approaching completion. Its massive 230-foot wingspan, 163-foot length, and 4-story tall tail assembly overwhelmed the experimental building and its workers. Aircraft 2135-70 would shortly be rolled out of the Fort Worth plant and introduced to the public for the first time. When compared to the B-29, the largest bomber in inventory at the time, the XB-36 was larger, but it would take another year for the XB-36 to fly. On July 20, 1946, taxi tests for the XB-36 commenced. The Air Force, eager to see the plane fly, conducted safety assessments. On August 7, 1946, taxi tests concluded late in the afternoon. The next day, after the longest development history of any airplane to date, the XB-36, piloted by Erickson and co-pilot Gus Green, took its long-awaited maiden flight.
At Carswell Air Force Base on August 8, 1946, I was privileged to be the test pilot in control of the XB-36 on its initial flight. The aircraft handled very nicely despite its size. There were no worrisome surprises.
The principal issues were insufficient engine cooling at high altitudes, severe propeller vibrations, and a succession of electrical failures. On test flight 16, a notable disaster occurred when the retraction cylinder on the right-hand landing gear failed, allowing the 9-foot wheel to swing freely in flight. Erickson and Green successfully landed the prototype by maneuvering right and left down the runway after touchdown, keeping the gear from collapsing. Severe damage or destruction of the prototype would have pushed flight testing back at least a year. The initiative had already received harsh criticism for being 3.5 years behind schedule. The prototype came to a stop in the soft dirt off the runway, its right side dangerously poised on its massive damaged landing gear. Eventually, the flaws were resolved, and the test program demonstrated the B-36's capability. On August 30, 1947, the first production model B-36A, serial number 44B9-2004, was delivered to Wright Field for acceptance, featuring a revised raised canopy for improved sight at roller skate landing gears. This was to be the final trip for Zebra 04. It was eventually dismantled after undergoing 45 static and dynamic structural tests. Until 1952, the XB-36 prototype with the buzz number 570 was used to test numerous systems, including the track landing gear and other variants. Unfortunately, the XB-36's career ended in 1957 at Carswell Air Force Base's fire pit, which was used to educate firefighters. In late 1946, the B-36 was chastised for its lack of speed over the target. In 1947, Consolidated recommended decreasing the contract from 100 to 95 B-36s to free up funding for the development and production of the C model, which would use Pratt & Whitney's variable discharge turbine variant of the R-4360 engine. The program had significant difficulties, and Air Materiel Command advised canceling both the VDT and the B-36C programs. With the first B-36A yet to arrive at Strategic Air Command, the entire program threatened termination. D.
June 1948, Berlin. Ever since the end of the war, 3 years before, tension had been increasing between the Allied military government and the Soviet bosses of East Berlin. 2.5 million people, more than half of Berlin's population, lived in the American, British, and French zones. But the whole city was surrounded by the Soviet zone of Germany. Supplying the 2.5 million people of the western sectors was a system of rails, canals, and roads. Suddenly, the Soviet military government in Berlin clamped down a land blockade of the Allied sectors of the city. They were trying to force the Western Allies to surrender their position in Berlin. And the weapon was hunger. With the fuel supply cut off, there wasn't much electricity. Nearly all of the lights went out.
The only way into Berlin was by plane. With the largest coordination of soldiers and aircraft in peacetime, the United States and its allies airlifted raw materials and food around the clock to save Berlin from crumbling under Russian control. America's deployment of both people and planes to break the Russian blockade demonstrated to our European allies that America would protect their interests as we had promised after the war. Not surprisingly, on the same day that the blockade began, it was decided to finish the projected B-36Cs as B models. After 11 months of running the Berlin airlift, the Russians capitulated in May 1949, and the blockade was lifted. The second aircraft evaluated by the Army Air Corps in 1941, Northrop's XB-35, would not profit from Russian hostilities. Instead, the decision to proceed with the B-36 would reduce the program's chances of survival on the limited post-war military budget. Despite the program's final failure, the Flying Wing is now regarded as one of the most significant aircraft designs in history. Northrop's early N-1M designs had been successful. Thus, the corporation moved forward with the N-9M1. On December 27, 1942, this one-third size prototype of the XB-35 made its first flight. It was to crash on May 19, 1943, killing the test pilot. In July 1945, the unfinished XB-35 No. 1 rolled out of the Hawthorne, California facility. Almost 1 year later, on June 25, 1946, it took to the skies. To rescue the program, Northrop proposed that 2 of the 13 YB-35s purchased be completed as all-jet versions. The Air Force agreed, therefore 2 YB-49s were produced. The number 1 YB-49 conducted its first flight on October 21, 1947. Early in the program, the YB-49 was discovered to have an unacceptable rate of yaw oscillations. The Air Force deemed it too unstable to be a viable bombing platform. The YB-49's flying wings produced exceptional performance results with top speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, but were judged inferior to the B-36 in terms of range and payload as a bomber. The Air Force has announced the employment of the flying wing design for long-range surveillance. The Air Force secured a contract for 30 RB-49As. Faced with budget cuts and claims of stability issues, the flying wing project was ultimately terminated on January 11, 1949, in favor of the B-36. With the demise of the flying wing, Consolidated Vol. T was able to focus on producing the now operational B-36. By November 1948, the 22A models were in operation, weighing 380 pounds gross. With 121 gallons of fuel and a 10,000-pound bomb load, the tactical range was 3,880 miles. A 72,000-pound bomb load provided a 200-mile tactical range. With a combat weight of 212,800 pounds, the maximum speed was 345 miles per hour at 31,600 feet, while the service ceiling was 39,100 feet. The A versions had no weaponry because they were solely used for training. Strategic Air Command's first operational B-36 unit was stationed at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, immediately across from the Convair facility. By the end of 1948, the 7th Strategic Air Command had been joined by the 11th at Carswell. Earlier experience had demonstrated the Strategic Air Command's requirement for capable aircraft. The B-36 would assist in addressing this need, but as with all new aircraft, it would require a shakedown period to iron out any issues.
I'd say that probably the first 2 years it was a rather exasperating plane to work on because you could, particularly I recall the constant speed drives, even though we had, initially we had about 3 of them on each airplane. I have actually personally been involved in changing 4 of them before we could get a plane airborne. I think the first 18 aircraft had aluminum wiring in them, and that aluminum wiring, the wind could change from the south to the north and it would break.
They didn't want to cannibalize parts. That was one of the things that early on people would, just to get an airplane going, they would steal a part off of a good airplane. Well, this just doubled your maintenance time because they'd have to put it back on this other airplane. So cannibalizations were kept to a minimum. If you had to cannibalize, you had to get permission from SAC headquarters, and boy, it better be a good reason to do it.
To fulfill the demand for skilled crews, Strategic Air Command implemented an intense training program to ensure battle readiness.
Here again, the manpower was such that the officer strength was cut back. The navigator and the bombardier positions were filled by a lot of them were former officers that had been re-enlisted as master sergeants or tech sergeants, and instead of given commissions, they were actually flying in those positions. In the early days at Carswell, well, when I first came here in 48, there were quite a few enlisted personnel serving as navigators, bombardiers, and radar operators.
The B versions began arriving in July 1949 with all of the required weaponry. The upgraded 3,500 horsepower R-43-60-41 Wasp Major boosted top speed to 381 miles per hour. The B-36 became the most heavily armed bomber in history, with 16 remote-controlled 20mm cannons coupled in the nose and tail, as well as 6 retractable turrets covered by sliding fuselage panels. Gunners manned computing stations in the nose and 6 blisters in the fuselage and directed the defensive firepower.
The rear cannons were radar-controlled.
The rear cannons were radar-operated. The massive bomb bay could hold up to 86,000 pounds of ordnance in 68 various configurations, including 2 Grand Slam bombs, any of the major atomic weapons of the time, and subsequently, the massive airdropped Mark 17 hydrogen bomb. The huge crew of up to 16 was divided into 2 areas of the aircraft. The pilot, engineer, navigator, bombardier, and gunner were all housed in the forward compartment. The aft cabin had 5 gunners. Once airborne, the aft part was reached by an 85-foot pressurized tunnel. The crew members lying on a cart would drag themselves down the tunnel by gripping an overhead rope to the aft cabin, which had bunks, a galley, and other amenities to make the long missions more bearable for the crew. One of the B-36's first major accomplishments caused the Air Force to feel embarrassed. To the dismay of the air defenses at Pearl Harbor, the flight and bomb drop went undetected. The latest model of the world's largest bomber, the B-36D, takes off on a test flight. The 230-foot wingspan plane, whose fuselage is so lengthy that the 15-man crew has to use a scooter to get around, is currently powered by 10 engines. 4 jet engines, 2 under each wing, have been added to the 6 standard reciprocating motors. The new type has a 10,000-mile range and a midway bomb load of 5 tons. The short-range cargo weighs 42 tons. It's an impressive boost to America's worldwide Air Force. As Consolidated Volte and Strategic Air Command focused on fine-tuning the B-36 and its mission, they quickly became the subject of criticism. A simmering conflict between the Navy and the Air Force erupts before the House Armed Services Committee in Washington. Captain John Cromwell, in the storm center of the controversy, sparked the battle. His sensational charges prompted Chairman Vinson and his committee to hear testimony from Secretary of the Navy Matthews and Admiral Denfeld, Chief of Naval Operations, that the Air Force, with its atom-carrying B-36 bomber, is attempting to displace the Navy in the defense scheme. Admiral William Blandy, a prominent Navy atomic expert, explains to the committee why each server should operate its weapon.
Now, I profess no such degree of technical expertness in aviation as would justify me in either praising or criticizing the particular merits of the B-36 as an airplane. Furthermore, I consider it primarily the province of the Air Force to determine exactly what weapons and devices should be developed and used to carry out its assigned roles and missions, just as the Army and the Navy should determine the weapons and devices needed to execute their mission without being dictated to or outvoted by officers of other services who lack the necessary knowledge and experience to qualify them to resolve such technical problems.
That spring, the Navy's massive aircraft carrier, the USS United States, was canceled in favor of the B-36 to meet the demand for long-range atomic striking capability. This outraged the Navy. The long-running dispute between the Air Force and the Navy was brought to public light when the Navy questioned the plane's capacity to carry out its mission as described.
It was saying that the B-36 could not perform its task. My crew was selected to be the one to go to Alaska and fly a profile mission back to the States. We were ferried up in a C-97 and given a couple days rest up there just to sit around and get rested up. But we had our mission drawn up to fly back, and another crew ferried the B-36 up there a couple days later, and it was refueled, and we crawled on board then and flew this mission back. But we took off out of Fairbanks, came down to the coast, followed the coast down to British Columbia, that area, came across to South Dakota, came down to Fort Worth and made our bomb run on Fort Worth, turned around, went back up to the Midwest someplace, and then over to the East Coast to New York, and back to Texas, and flew a round robin. And we ended up flying 33.5-hour mission on that sortie.
Ultimately, the decision to discontinue the carrier was affirmed. As the military and Congress struggled over finances, Americans relished the return to routine after 3.5 years of conflict. We were confident in our position as the world's strongest and richest nation. However, over time, trust in the American way of life eroded. Americans watched as communism achieved significant territorial and technological gains. Random atmospheric samples obtained over the Sea of Japan in September 1949 shocked the American public by revealing Russia as the nuclear club's second member. 1 month later, in October, China became the People's Republic of China, or Communist China. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean Communists crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. In the early days, the North Koreans drove United Nations troops south in retreat. There was a call for air support. With few strategic targets in North Korea, the majority of the air war in Korea was spent assisting ground forces. The newest jet fighters proved themselves capable and durable in the Korean War, helped to free up funds for military investment and the development of jet aircraft. The B-36 was never deployed to the Korean theater, but it remained Strategic Air Command's primary deterrent against Russia throughout the Korean conflict. In November 1950, the new Pratt & Whitney R-436-53 engines with 300 to 800 horsepower were installed on Ship 49-270. This was identified as the first B-36F model. In total, 58 F models were delivered by the end of 1951. The maximum speed was 417 miles per hour with a combat-loaded service ceiling of 44,000 feet. The 156 H models that followed differed solely in terms of electronic update. Nature, not the Russians, handed Strategic Air Command its most devastating blow during the Cold War era. On Labor Day, September 1, 1952, a tornado smashed across the flight line at Carswell Air Force Base. 71 B-36s were decommissioned, accounting for over half of Strategic Air Command's heavy bomber force. Tom Neely served on the review team that assessed damage from the Convair plant.
We came back from our holiday and went to work on Tuesday, found about the storm across the way, and organized a survey crew to go over and assess the damage. We went over on Wednesday and were briefed on the immediate needs to see 10 aircraft that they had previously evaluated, thought they might be returned to service earlier than the remainder of them. The first aircraft that was returned to service 1 week later, and the remainder within 2 weeks. Then we started looking at the severely damaged aircraft, the ones that's components were off and knocked off and were on the ground, outer wings off, fuselage is broken, tails gone. There was more tail damage than any one major damage.
By October 5th, 51 planes had returned to duty thanks to the Convair facility. 19 of the more badly damaged were hauled to Convair and refurbished in the plant, with the last returning to service on May 11, 1953. Only one aircraft, 49-2051, did not return to service. It was later used as a ground test vehicle for a hydrogen bomb test in New Mexico. The final 33 B-36s constructed were designated J types. The J model wings carried an additional 2,770 gallons of fuel, bringing the total to 36,396 gallons. The gross weight was 410,000 pounds. A top speed of 401 miles per hour was recorded with a combat weight of 171,035 pounds. The final 14 J models were finished as Class 3 featherweights. To maximize speed and range, all extraneous weight was removed, and the weaponry was reduced to just the tail cannons. The last B-36 was delivered to Strategic Air Command on August 14, 1954. Less than a year later, in June 1955, Strategic Air Command got its first Boeing B-52. The speedier all-jet B-52 series would eventually replace the Strategic Air Command's first intercontinental bomber. In its last years of service, the B-36's range was quickly overshadowed by a demand for speed. Convair's B-58. Hustler flew for the first time in 1956. By the end of the decade, the world's first supersonic bomber would be in service. In October 1957, America discovered that Russia had beaten us to space with the launch of Sputnik. This episode sparked fears of a nuclear strike by intercontinental missiles rather than intercontinental bombers. The B-36 period would quietly end in 1959. Throughout its service life, the B-36 represented the new Strategic Air Command's policy of peace by air power. B-36s and their crews were sent all over the world to strengthen our intercontinental strike capability. This point was not lost on the Russians, and it is often regarded as America's most compelling case against Soviet aggression during the Cold War. It's easy to understand why. Strategic Air Command was responsible for establishing the B-36's global footprint. It had progressed from being the inheritor of a post-war buildup of men and equipment to one of the most trained organizations in military history.
You'd go out 2 hours prior to takeoff. You'd have the co-pilot and a couple of the gunners go by in-flight kitchens and pick up the lunches. And while you were flying the 18 hours, there were 3 pilots, 3 navigators, and radar operators. And everyone would take turns of working about 4-hour shifts and 4 hours off, and that way the crew stayed rested. But it turned into a 24-hour day by the time you came back, landed, pre-flighted your equipment, and then debriefed. So you were gone flying and the activity for a 24-hour period. And you'd fly every 10 days.
Crew integrity was one of the prime things that General May stressed at that time, and he had several means of making sure that the crews stayed together, with like the spot promotion, and which was a very important thing to everybody that was involved in it. SAC was the envy of the Air Force at that time. The other commands didn't have it.
As B-36 crews deployed to all corners of the world, Americans at home were obsessed with the Red Menace. If the fear of communist infiltration wasn't enough, the American people were obsessed with another dark nightmare. During the Cold War, B-36 crews had to contend with the possibility of nuclear war at all times.
All select crews, lead crews, and ready crews which encompassed all of us, were briefed and had targets assigned and had atomic bombs allocated to our aircraft, and the aircraft could be put on alert and held and ready and be off the ground in less than 5 minutes.
Faced with a possible conflict, would have to go to war. We were the ones that would have to really look out for ourselves at home because, and I know this may sound silly today, but back in the early 50s, we would keep our blinds closed at home because we never knew. We were under the impression that someone could go down the street, take a pot shot at us, and if they could, those were the primary people on the crew, the radar operator and the aircraft commander. If they could do away with either one or both of those, that crew would be ineffective. They'd, wiped out. They wouldn't make the target.
Our darkest worries were allayed thanks to Strategic Air Command's capacity to carry out its task. During its military life, the B-36 underwent several modifications and served as a flying test bed for a variety of hypotheses. Its enormous size and range made it possible to conduct experiments that no other aircraft had ever attempted. The first modification was a transport version called the XC-99. On December 31, 1942, the Army Air Forces ordered a prototype transport plane. Using the same wings, engines, and landing gear as the XB-36, the fuselage was 20 feet 6 inches tall and 182 feet 6 inches long, with a payload capacity of 100,000 pounds, or 400 troops. On November 24, 1947, the XC-99 conducted its first flight. Consolidated Volte designed a production version with cargo doors fore and aft to transport heavy cars. Only one prototype XC-99 would be built. Until its retirement in March 1957, the XC-99 flew 7,400 hours at a cheaper cost per ton-mile when laden than any other cargo aircraft. Convair created the YB-60, a swept-wing all-jet version of the B-36, to bring the aircraft into the jet age. The YB-60 measured 175 feet 2 inches long and had a wingspan of 206 feet 5 inches. The YB-60 was powered by 8 Pratt & Whitney XJ57P3 turbojet engines. Due to a lack of weapons, the crew was limited to 5. The combat weight of 250 pounds resulted in a peak speed of 508 miles per hour at 39,250 feet. 2 YB-60s were built without full tactical weaponry. The YB-60, which traveled over 100 miles per hour slower than the Boeing B-52, was deemed insufficient for manufacturing. The most intriguing version of the B-36 was the NB-36H Crusader program. This effort resulted from an Air Force contract to create a nuclear-powered aircraft. This program's test plane was modified 51-57-12, which had been destroyed by a tornado. The Crusader carried a 1-megawatt power reactor in its bomb bay. A protected crane lowered the reactor into a trench from which it was hauled under remote control into the aft bomb bay. The heat generated by the reactor was dissipated via a cooling mechanism in the aft fuselage. A 5-ton shielding plate was installed at the forward end of the aft bomb bay to protect the crew. Once the Crusader was airborne, the nuclear engineer activated the reactor by removing the safety rods. Radiation was detected throughout the airplane using cabin instruments, while the B-50 escort plane assessed the amount of radiation emitted into the atmosphere. Television cameras positioned on the aft external fuselage monitored the engines. The crew couldn't see or hear them in the fully insulated crew compartment. The NB-36H flew 47 times between September 1955 and March 1957. The program demonstrated the infeasibility of nuclear-powered aircraft due to the effects of residual radiation on the aircraft. The Second World War demonstrated the importance of fighter escort on raids deep into enemy territory. The B-36's range rendered the development of a self-sustaining fighter impractical at the time. The FICON project's initial attempt was the parasite fighter, the XF-85, designed by McDonnell Aircraft. The fighter, dubbed the Goblin, was meant to fit completely inside the B-36 bomb bay. The plane had a small 6-section tail assembly. With the wings extended, the wingspan was 21 feet and 1 inch. Folded, the Goblin measured only 5 feet 5 inches wide. The length was only 14 feet 10 inches. Built around a 3,000-pound thrust. Westinghouse J-34WE-22 engine, the Goblin had around 30 minutes of fuel at cruise and 20 minutes at maximum power. The maximum speed was 648 miles per hour. The first flight of the XF-85 took place on August 23, 1948, from a modified B-29, as the B-36 was not then ready. Although the aircraft worked as expected, lowering and recovering the parasite using the trapeze proved to be incredibly challenging. Under battle conditions, the notion was thought to be nearly useless. The program was discontinued after 7 test flights. The third attempt at the FICON program began in January 1952 with tests. A modified F-84E was to be launched and recovered in flight as needed. In May 1953, the first successful recovery test with a modified B-36F aircraft 49-2707 and an RF-84K resulted in a contract for 10 B-36 and 25 Republic RF-84 Kias to be adapted for the program. The selection of B-36s and RF-84s suggested that the Air Force believed this project was more suited to reconnaissance than fighter escort missions. TomTom was the latest and least successful FICON program. This idea called for attaching an RF-84 to each wingtip of a B-36 using a custom hook. Povitz discomfort on extended flights, along with an accident caused by the powerful wingtip vortices, led to the cancellation of the program in late 1953. The last B-36 was built in 1954 with aircraft number 52-2827. On August 8th, it was the topic of a ceremony to mark the end of the program. The festivities also signaled the end of an era. The propeller-driven aircraft were being phased out as the new jet age began. In total, 383 B-36s were constructed at an average cost of $3,776,000 apiece. This final B-36 was the subject of another ceremony on February 12, 1959, when it was flown to Carter Field in Fort Worth, Texas for permanent static display. The B-36s had completed their final flight by the end of February. The fleet was officially deactivated and moved to Davis-Monthan, Arizona. They were cannibalized and left in the scorching light of the desert boneyard to be sold for scrap metal. Despite being salvaged from the smelter, aircraft 52-2827 remained abandoned for several years, the target of vandalism and neglect. In 1979, the newly created Southwest Aerospace Museum saved the plane from the scrapyard. For more than a year and a half, volunteers worked on disassembling and transporting the airplane. This plane is now located in White Settlement outside the gates of General Dynamics and near Carswell Air Force Base, where it previously served. This aircraft, one of just 4 remaining on public display, is still being fully restored. The B-36 is an homage to the thousands of individuals who planned, tested, and constructed it. The accomplishment of its mission pays respect to the personnel who flew and maintained this aircraft during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. A time when dread and unrest rather than combat shaped the lives of the B-36 and those around it.